Hello and welcome to another edition of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Today I'm joined by a special guest all the way from Sydney. This is Luke Barnes, who is a senior lecturer at the Western University of Sydney. He's an astrophysicist and is interested in the origin of the universe. He's also author of this fantastic book, A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos. And fine-tuning as a topic is certainly one of his life's passions. So, Luke, today what we're going to be talking about are objections to the fine-tuning argument for a divine being. So, number one, the anthropic principle. The idea here being that, well, it's no big surprise that we live in a universe where there's life which was arranged to permit life, because if the universe wasn't arranged to permit life, then we wouldn't be here to ask the question. So it's almost like a non-surprise. It's not really an interesting phenomenon at all. What do you say in response to that as an argument against the fine-tuning argument for a designer?
So in astronomy, we're very used to dealing with what are called selection effects. So you want to study the universe. You want to know what galaxies are out there, for example. But what you have to keep in mind is that when we look at the universe, right, we don't just get a sort of God's eye view of everything. We aren't just sort of flying around looking at whatever we like. We're here on a planet with a very particular telescope, with a particular lens, particular filter, particular detector. And of all the galaxies, of the population of galaxies, our instruments select some of those to be observable and misses other ones. If they're too faint, we won't see it. Maybe if it's too diffuse, we won't see it. It's got to be concentrated. Whatever those selection effects are, if it's very bright in this wavelength of light, but not this one, we might miss it in this filter. Those are the things you've got to take into account. So why do we see galaxy? Why do I see that galaxy in the distant universe? One of the answers to that will be, well, because if it wasn't really bright, I wouldn't see it at all, right? Why do I see those galaxies? Because, if they weren't that bright, I wouldn't see them. That in itself just isn't enough to explain why there are galaxies at all. So you have to have a population before a selection effect can help you explain why it has certain properties rather than other ways it could have been. And so the question that's left unanswered by the anthropic principle is just, why is there a life-permitting universe at all? If naturalism is true, if the universe just is and that's all there is to it, it's entirely possible that there could have just been a dead, empty universe with no one around to look at it. Why isn't that the universe that exists? Why is it this one? And the anthropic principle is just completely powerless again to answer that question. Where it could come in is the multiverse. If you actually have a population of universes, then a selection effect can do something. But you've got to have that population first.
Well, that leads us very nicely into the second topic, which is, of course, the multiverse. So the argument here being that, well, it's perfectly feasible. Some people might say it's even likely from the physics that this is not the only universe out there. There are thousands, millions, maybe even infinite universes. And we just so happen to be in the one which gives rise to life. And as you say, that's when the anthropic principle really kicks in. So what do you say as the postulation of the multiverse as an argument against fine-tuning argument for a designer?
The thing that I think fine-tuning really answers is the question, this universe we see, is this sort of typical of just any old universe? It seems a pretty amazing place, right? Go watch a slow motion video of a hummingbird for a while and you'll convince yourself it's a pretty astounding place. But maybe that's just our impression. Maybe it's just any old universe. If you just put any old matter in to a universe, it'll eventually arrange itself into a hummingbird. And I think fine-tuning says, well, actually down at the deepest physics we've got, right, which we've actually tested, I should say, where everyone goes, yes, that's the sort of best model we have of the universe, the standard models, as they're called, of cosmology and particle physics. If you mess around there with these particles, with the properties, I should say, then no, this isn't a typical universe. right? Most possible universes at the level of those dials don't have hummingbirds in them at all. The stuff just won't even stick together. You won't even make galaxies, let alone all the other sort of stuff. So now the objection says, well, what if there's deeper physics underneath it that sort of makes lots of universes, and then and then there's more chances for the right physics to turn up and then a hummingbird to turn up. And the answer to that is, well, remember what we were doing? We're trying to look at as deep as we could go and say, is it typical? Not just does this explain that, not just does the physics we know explain hummingbirds, but could typical, just any old physics explain hummingbirds? And so if we go down another level, the question is not fundamentally, is there a multiverse, which we don't have the slightest clue anyway, right? But if we're in a multiverse, is this a typical multiverse? Maybe there are multiverses where it just produces all dead universes, right? Maybe you've got to fine-tune the multiverse in order to make the right universe, in order to make the hummingbird. And that's the question we have to ask, and it's the question that no one has a clue how to answer because there is no standard model of the multiverse. We don't have the parameters, we don't have the dials to turn. There's just no standard model there for us to work with. So, we have no idea whether there is a multiverse or not. All of the physics that predicts that is not standard model physics. It's extensions. They're sometimes reasonable extensions like cosmic inflation, but they are extensions. There's no observation we have of the universe that demands or even really suggests a multiverse, except for the fine-tuning of the universe, of course. And so I think the situation we're in now, and things might change tomorrow, but the situation we're in now is, it's sort of hoping that our ignorance might suddenly turn the whole situation around and our universe will look typical and boring and not remarkable all over again.
Yeah, I mean, to a theist, it sounds almost like a kind of universe of the gaps type thing. It's trying to find something to plug a deficiency in our understanding, but it doesn't really answer more questions. And of course, the other thing is that it just makes it even harder as to the original question of, well, how did any of these multiverses arise? That hasn't been answered at all by postulating the existence of a multiverse. Is that right?
I mean, the hope is that maybe there's a really simple mechanism that we could propose, which will make lots of universes. This universe will be random, but it'll turn up eventually. And the underlying physics of the multiverse will be nice and simple and won't need to be fine-tuned. And no one has the slightest clue whether that's true at all, because, again, we don't have a standard model of the multiverse. We've got some toy models that sort of might maybe work. I should say it's a physics idea. It's a cosmology idea. So we should try and test it and think about it. I don't want to just sort of play they're only saying that because of this card, right, which you can sort of play wherever you like. I want to try and test it and think about it. But, as part of that, I want to sort of take stock of where we are. And the possibility of a multiverse is just that. It's just a possibility. So it shouldn't really change our minds. The fact that you can imagine a way of getting out of the fine-tuning argument doesn't mean you've got a way out of the fine-tuning argument.
Exactly. But just as a side, say if, in 10 years' time, physicists are pretty convinced that there is a multiverse. There's some way. I mean, I can't imagine what that way would be, but actually it seems like a high probability or high likelihood. Where does that leave a theist or believer with regard to fine-tuning? Does it shatter their belief, or what effect would it have on you, say?
Well, so the idea, the method we're using here is, I want to know if this universe is typical. So I've got to compare it to something, right? Okay, so what do I compare it to? Can't see any other universes, but I can at least use theoretical physics to explore a set of other universes. What if there's a multiverse? Well, now there's got to be deeper physics that tells us there's a multiverse. So what I can do, right, the way we approach the problem now is taking the deepest physics we've got, which is actually supported by the evidence, and then turning some dials and seeing what happens. Well, if physics goes deeper tomorrow, then I go to those laws and I start turning their dials. And if there's absolutely no dials to turn, that's really interesting. right? Because then I'd start to think, okay, well now I've got to think about what other mathematical constructs or other symmetries or something like that. Then we're in a very different place, very different conversation. Maybe we still think the universe is tuned in some sense from that. But down a level, probably the multiverse will have a bunch of dials as well, and then we go change those. And maybe at the end of that, we say, well, the multiverse is fine-tuned, and we're back where we started. There's something remarkable going on around here. Or maybe we find out you've got to tune a multiverse just right so that the life that turns up in it is like us, rather than just being like a single brain in a it's called a Boltzmann brain, like just one cloud just spontaneously forms a brain which has a couple of thoughts and then dissolves back into this. So there's all sorts of problems you've got to worry about with these dials, but at the moment we just don't have a theory. I haven't got any dials. Like I can't do theoretical physics with the multiverse right now.
Okay, so this is one you hear sometimes, that the fine-tuning is not evidence that the universe was made for life. It's just that life had to arise in the circumstances of the universe. In other words, invoking kind of purpose or causation is incorrect.
Yeah, so sometimes people say life, the universe isn't fine-tuned for life. Life is fine-tuned for the universe.
Yeah.
Now, the assumption behind that is, give me any old universe and it'll make life eventually. And that's false. I'll make a universe with no life in it, no problemo. With a turn of the cosmological constant dial, I can make a universe where no two particles ever touch each other in the entire history of the universe. All right, bon appetit. Where's the life? What are you gonna do? Right? There's literally no interaction between anything ever. Right? Whatever your definition of life, something better happen. Whether you think it's, replication, or whether you want the whole of Darwinian evolution being possible, or whether you just want metabolism or some sort of, information being represented, two particles better touch at some point. So I think the people who make that objection are, have not really looked at these cases, not really looked at the fine-tuning cases. You can properly ruin a universe by twisting these dials the wrong way.
By a tiny amount. Okay, so another one, which actually I hear from physicists, so your kind of colleagues, is that when we're talking about turning the dials, we're really just dabbling in things we don't know. There are maybe other constants, there are unknown probability distributions. We don't really know what would happen if you change this, that might also change that, and therefore we get something which we just cannot possibly predict. So aren't some of these turn the dial, see what happens arguments very simplistic?
So there's a couple of things there. One of them is, could there be deeper physics? And the answer is sure. I mean, I think the fine-tuning argument is best thought of as, let's just take stock of where we are. And we've had, a century or more of atheists saying, the more we look at the universe, the more we know that it's not designed and there's no one behind it. And, Dawkins saying, the universe at bottom, it's exactly what you'd expect if there was no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, something like that. So they've not been shy about saying what they've concluded from looking at the universe. And now that the evidence sort of turned the other way pretty dramatically in the 70s, as I was saying, and now, now we definitely shouldn't draw any conclusions. We should be very careful about this sort of drawing any conclusions from science about what might be behind the universe. Yeah, come on, mate. So there's that objection. We're just taking stock. We're using the best physics we've got. In particular, that there shouldn't be any sort of bias in the method here. I've chosen the physics to vary the constants of, not at random. It's the ones that the data of our universe have selected as being, as of now, the best laws we have. So I if anything, I've biased it in favor of the naturalist. I've chosen laws we already know can be life permitting, right? And so there's every opportunity that if I twisted these dials, I could just make life a bit like this or a bit like that, or all the carbon's a little bit heavy, and who cares, right? It could have been the case that if you turn these dials, we are just any old universe, and any old sludge can make life, and we'll be fine. And if that's what had happened, then this would have been taken as the ultimate vindication of the accidental universe, right? Look at this, I can turn this parameter, turn that parameter, it'll all be fine, right? The fact that it turned out the other way doesn't mean you're now, you're allowed to quit the game, right? That's the way it is. There's a number of other things, worries about probabilities are interesting. I think there's sort of technical details there, but I think there's ways of doing probability which we need in physics, which are strong enough to undergird the fine-tuning argument, these Bayesian ways of thinking. But we can go into more detail that if you want. Or I've got a paper on that, so if you want to read it.
Yep, we will link that paper if you want us. That's great. Okay, so now we're into the kind of, I don't know, just throwing things at it, I think. So one of them is, this is just another God of the gaps argument. Before we used to think thunder was due to mountain gods. Then we found out that it was related to discharge of electricity. We think the universe is fine-tuned, but actually, and therefore we invoke a god, but actually when we find out more, we'll realize it's all just naturalistic processes. So why should this be any different to all the other gods of the gaps which have since been removed?
So this is a very important point. What fine-tuning is pointing towards is not empirical phenomena in our universe, which, stuff we observe, that science can't explain. It's precisely the stuff that we can explain, right? We deliberately went for the best laws we've got, the laws that explain the most, right? We've gone for let's have all the scientific explanation you want, and then let's ask this deeper metaphysical question: are we sort of typical? Look, here's the laws and here's the parameters, here's the numbers. They do all the explaining. That's all great. I'm not poking any gaps there. Let's assume it explains everything, right? Now, is this sort of reality the sort of typical place that might turn up if a universe just kind of happened with no deeper explanation behind it, as the naturalists want us to believe? Well, now we go to those laws and we start looking at counterfactuals. This is the important difference. I'm not saying there's a conflict between the laws and our observations. What we're doing is taking the laws we have, which explain our universe, and now saying what would have been. These are sort of hypotheticals that allow us to explore this deeper question. So there's no empirical gap here. I'm not saying that the laws of nature or the things in nature are incapable of producing this or producing that. It's not like, for example, the argument from The Origin of Life, which tries to argue, if you have an Earth and you have all these chemicals and you leave it for 1 billion years, nothing will happen. Life won't happen. So it must be something more than what's there naturally. That's a totally different argument. That's where you say these physical causes can't produce this physical effect, right? Fine-tuning doesn't say that. Fine-tuning says, let's have all these physical causes and let's compare them with the way they could have been hypothetically. And as far as you know on naturalism, there's nothing wrong with these other hypothetical universes. We can describe them perfectly mathematically consistently. So those are the other ways the universe could have been, according to, as far as naturalism knows. Let's compare the two. So yeah, there's no gap there.
Yeah, so I think just to clarify, so the difference between the argument for of life arising versus this is that this immediately goes to a kind of metaphysical level rather than just we can't explain the physical. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not saying we should therefore throw away the standard models of physics, right? I'm not saying they're done either. I mean, let's keep doing science. I'm perfectly happy to keep doing science. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, and I'm also not, I'm not saying there's something about nature they can't explain, and I'm not saying that there's something we see which has to be a miracle, right? Literally, this only exists if you break the laws of nature. I'm not proposing any laws get broken. Right? I'm saying God laid them down right in the first place to do a whole bunch of interesting stuff. Right? No, I don't need any laws to be broken for this argument.
All right. So this is one which, you hear quite a lot of people online. Okay, you've come up with an explanation, but this isn't proof. We need more than this. To believe in something as amazing as God or a designer, we need actual proof. And this doesn't count as proof. It's just another possible explanation.
Yeah, that's way too high a bar. So, mathematicians prove things, right? No scientist has ever proven anything, right? Not using the scientific method. There's evidence, but it's not proof. That's just not what we do. Once you've proven Pythagoras' theorem, you're done. It's, we won't discover tomorrow that we were wrong, right? Unless we all got that proof wrong, which is very unlikely. But, once it's proven, it's proven. I don't need to go check whether Pythagoras' theorem is true over in that galaxy over there, right? That's just not what science does. So what we're doing here is looking at evidence. We're looking at the way the world is and trying to think what's the best explanation for why it is the way it is. And that's an appropriate sort of phrase there, the best explanation. Right? We're not asking what you can believe. In light of fine-tuning, you can believe, right, that it's all luck, right? We just got the right numbers. Here we are. You don't even need a multiverse. We just, this is what happened. Deal with it. You can believe that. But that's not what rationality is. We're not interested in what's possible to believe, because there's a lot of things that are possible to believe. We want to know what's the best explanation of the facts. And so if you want to say, and remember, we're not at the level of, we're trying to look underneath physics. So the fact that God isn't the sort of thing described by physics is precisely the point, right? We're asking what's beyond the ultimate laws. Is it, as theists say, God, a mind? Is it as naturalists say, nothing at all, of the ultimate laws at least, maybe not the laws that we know about? Is it something else? Is it a mathematical reality, or is it something else? Right? These are the questions we're asking. But if you ask what's deeper than physics, the fact that any answer to that other than the nothing answer is not going to look like physics, not going to look like a physical entity, is precisely the point.
Okay, and then another kind of catchphrase. Dawkins has used this many times. Invoking God to explain fine-tuning is just kicking the question down the road. Who designed the designer? Who, as Alex O'Connor said recently, who fine-tuned the fine-tuner? Who created the creator?
Okay, so here's where I actually think the people who defend this argument, including myself, should really put our cards on the table earlier. So we sort of sometimes give this. I've heard Eric Weinstein call this Jesus smuggling, where when we do it, where you just you're talking about physics and everything seems all right for a while, and then you just try and throw Jesus in there. The point being, we pretend that this is sort of naturally flows out of physics and it's all the same, but that the picture you get is of a natural cosmos. Here's the universe, the physical universe, and then God is just sort of stapled on the outside. And I think what we should be doing is saying, I've tried this recently at a debate against in Durham recently, where I sort of tried this out. We're proposing something radical. We're saying, what's the most basic kind of entity, substance, stuff, thing? What's the most basic kind of thing out there? Which is a pretty basic question to start asking. If you're a naturalist, the most basic kind of stuff is physical stuff, whatever that might be. Fields, particles, space-time, whatever that is. We're saying, right, no, that's not the most basic kind of stuff. The most basic kind of thing is a mind, right? Not a brain. A mind is the most basic kind of entity, right? Consciousness is more fundamental than physics, right? Because there is a mind underneath. That's really what sort of reality is made of, if you want to put it that way. That's what we're saying is at the bottom. So if you say, who designed the designer? Well, we think minds, in terms of conscious thought, is the most basic kind of thing. So those sorts of things, that this ultimate mind doesn't need a deeper explanation. In the same way as when the naturalist, just putting those shoes on for a second, if I say is that matter is the most basic kind of thing, it doesn't make any sense to object to that and say, oh, but what's the matter made out of? No, it's supposed to be the bottom. Right? That's the whole idea. That's not a good objection, right? I am proposing for reality, it's matter at the bottom. Okay, good. If that's true, the question, what matter is the matter made out of, is a silly question. The same idea, if you're putting a mind at the bottom, saying, what mind made that mind, it just doesn't make any sense. The whole point is that there's a mind, thoughts, consciousness, that sort of thing is what's at the bottom of reality. The whole point is to end it at one ultimate mind who doesn't have to look outside of itself for an explanation for its own existence.
And I think the other thing is that's often misunderstood is that the mind that you're proposing is by definition in this argument uncreated, eternal, and necessary. So to then argue against something else is really straw manning. That is not, we're not talking about a created or non-eternal mind. This is the proposal. You might not like it, but you can't argue against something else, which we're not proposing.
Yeah. I think the accusation is that the sort of instinct here is that it's special pleading. Right. If you say this sort of thing has to have a designer, but this thing I've got over here doesn't need a designer, and so my thing is immune from having to have a designer. What makes it different? And the answer to that is the question, what makes it different, is not a rhetorical question. Right? Minds have forethought, right? Foresight. I can plan something. I can imagine something before I bring it about. Matter just doesn't have that unless you've got some really weird matter, which might as well be a mind, right? And so if we see things in the world that look like foresight, that look like planning ahead, that look like purpose, that's a reason to go with the designer at the bottom rather than matter at the bottom, right? So it's not special pleading when we're talking about what's at the bottom.
Yeah, I think this whole question of purpose never really is I think you've touched on a really important point, but that's another real problem with the whole naturalist approach and the multiverse approach, that it never adds purpose to anything. I mean, people kind of escape it really by saying we can find purpose in our lives, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what's the point of the whole process, the whole project here. I think that's a big gap for the naturalist explanation. All right, now this is a good one. I think this is actually stronger than some of the other ones. Okay, say the naturalist is willing to accept the possibility that there could be a supernatural mind which has done all this. It will only take us to deism or deism, that there is some supernatural power which did all of this, but we can't say any more about it. We certainly can't go from that to the God of Christians or the God of Muslims or the divine entity of the Vedas or things like that. It takes us to such a low level that it's almost like we've said nothing at all. It certainly doesn't lead to theism. What would you say in response to that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've given a very good, solid argument that atheism is wrong. I mean, that's not nothing. Like naturalism turns out to be false. It's been the sort of dominant, certainly the dominant assumption, if not explicit philosophy, behind so much of science for the last century. And it turned out to be wrong. I think that's a huge conclusion. So if we say, look, before we looked at this, there was a bunch of options available to us: atheism, deism, theism of various kinds, whatever, any other isms, pantheism, I suppose, whatever, right? And if of that group, right, and within atheism you've got naturalism and other kinds of atheism. If within that group you've either cut out the whole of atheism or at least the naturalistic versions of that, that's a huge. I'll take that, sure. I think that's a huge conclusion. What it means is, there's definitely something can we know more about it? Now, even if the answer to that is we can't learn more about it from fine tuning, doesn't mean we can't know more about it at all. So, for example, people want to say something. I might be sort of prefiguring a question, but is it just a finite designer or a simulator in the next universe up? Well, if fine tuning might not tell us that, in which case we can think about other arguments like cosmological arguments. If you want an ultimate explanation for not just why this universe rather than that universe, but why any universe, any reality at all, obviously just some simulator in the next universe up's not going to do that. But now we're looking at those arguments not from the point of view of the atheist who's like, I can, none of these work, they're all garbage. No, one of them's got to be right now. Right, atheism's gone, or at least the naturalistic version of it. That's out. See you later. Right, you've now got to look at a whole bunch of options that are metaphysically thick, if you want to put it that way, rather than metaphysically, either thin or emaciated, like naturalism, depending on how you want to see it. But I think that's a huge conclusion. And more than that, I think it's obvious what the next sort of evidence is going to be as you take those claims on board. So, for example, Deism versus theism more or less comes down to the fact is had God revealed anything about God's self to us in any particular way? And then if, Christianity makes certain clear historical claims, Islam makes certain clear historical claims. Get busy, right? The fact that you can't derive it from physics doesn't mean you can't do anything. Like now you've just got a different kind of, mostly historical, to be honest, investigation to try and take that next step. Maybe after all that, you're still stuck in deism, but you won't know until you at least, go and have a look.
Yeah, exactly. For me, apart from what you said about what it does to atheism, it then prompts the next step. The next step now becomes super important. The idea that there is something higher out there suddenly becomes actually probably the most important thing about your existence. So whatever path you're going to go down, you've definitely got work to be done. All right, okay. And then another one, which isn't really an argument against the fine-tuning argument for God, but it's a classically thrown in. Well, if this designer designed this universe, why did he put so much suffering in it? Why is there so much inefficiency? Why all these species which ended in extinction? Why all these billions of galaxies which, don't seem to do anything and just fizzle out after trillions of years? That just doesn't seem like the type of God that, we would expect. So yeah, it just leads us to a new hard wall that we're going to bang our head against, suffering and inefficiency in the universe.
Yeah, so I think they're the sort of two sides of the same coin. Like, what sort of universe would you expect on theism? And it on one level, it's plausible to say on any of the forms of theism, if your God is also the sort of ground in some sense of meaning and purpose and morality, there are probably opportunities for, it's not ridiculously unlikely that God would make a universe with finite beings, what Robin Collins calls embodied conscious agents. Richard Swinburne's very good on this as well, where they have the opportunity to have a meaningful moral life because now morality and ethics aren't just a purely human thing; they're now cosmic, right? We've got somewhere to put them, right? We're not just atheists anymore. Naturalism's gone out the door. So the question now of okay, but then the flip side, why would God make a universe in which conscious agents suffer so much? It's obviously, one of the oldest and deepest questions of existence. But I think at the end of the day, if I'm just staying within the fine-tuning argument, I think, just take the hit and say, look, I don't know why there's all the sort of pain and suffering, but at least I know why there's conscious experience at all. And what's a typical theistic universe look like? Okay, maybe I wouldn't expect it to have this much suffering, but how unlikely do you really think it is? Because the question you should be asking is not just, is a universe with this much suffering more likely than not on theism? That's not the question to ask. The question is, how likely is it on theism versus how likely on naturalism, right? If we're doing that, right? And And what's a typical universe on naturalism? Fine-tuning says, well, we did that calculation and it's completely empty. Like there's no. This is why when the naturalist imagines a naturalistic universe, they're just taking our universe and saying that's a naturalistic universe. It's an example of a naturalistic universe if you take God out and you sort of do the right sort of metaphysics behind the scenes, so there's nothing else. But it's not a typical naturalistic universe. You can't just help yourself to it. It's not what would typically happen. It's not what you would expect, right? If they can make that move, I can just say, well, this is just the universe God wanted, and that's all there is to it. And if you see that that's not a good enough answer, then the naturalist is saying, oh yeah, this is the universe we'd expect, science and all this stuff. No, you don't. You got to consider the other ways the universe might have been, and most of those on naturalism are dead. Beyond that, there's an awful lot that's been written about suffering, but it's at that higher level of, I think now it matters how thick your theism is. If it's pure deism, versus the different sort of kinds of theism, now the question of why is there suffering at all is something that's going to come down to a sort of thicker, more full picture of why God creates at all, what sort of thing God thinks is good, what sort of things are ultimate if God exists, what sort of what God is trying to do in creation, right? So I think often when I hear this sort of objection, the person has the idea that what God really wanted to make was like a pet sanctuary for their favorite pets. With just, there's a PZ Myers actually wrote a blog post on this where he was like, why isn't the universe just millions of acres of lakefront property with lovely fishing? And okay, maybe, but maybe God doesn't want to make pets. Maybe he's got something more, maybe pure pleasure isn't the only thing God wants to create. Maybe there are higher forms of goodness. And all these considerations only need to be, maybe, right? Because they're not as improbable as any life at all on a naturalistic hypothesis.
Very good. So they're the main objections which I wanted to go through. Just on a final topic, one of the things which I'm always intrigued by is why atheists are atheists. Why is it so obvious to believers? All of the things that we've discussed are so obvious, but for atheists, it's just not obvious, but also not convincing. What do you think is going on in terms of psychology or ways of looking at the world, or personal agendas? What do you think? You talk to a lot of people, you've debated a lot of people on this. Why do you think they hold on to their atheism in, say, the face of fine-tuning and all the things we've talked about?
A couple of things. One of them is, I think, if you think, as Dawkins sort of points towards a bit in the God Delusion, if you think of God as a really complicated brain in the sky with all these magical powers, then there's almost no argument that could convince you that God exists, just because it's never a step forward. But we explain, to be an explanation is to have something complicated explained in terms of something simpler. And so, however complicated the universe is, if you reach for God, this is Dawkins' point, right? You've reached for something more complicated than the thing you're trying to explain. So, you always lose that game probabilistically. And this is why it's so important to sort of lay down the ground rules of, no, I'm not building God out of matter, right? God is not a brain in the sky. I'm saying a mind is the most fundamental type of entity that exists. And so if you've got that instinct, if your picture of God, whatever jumps in your mind is I was going to say guy with a long white beard, but sort of a heavenly yourself. That picture of God on the clouds and just sort of hanging around the edge of the universe and being grumpy about people doing things he disapproves of, and then there's just there's all the evidence can't point to that. That's obviously a step backwards so if that's going to exist, I would need that to just turn up and say hello to me, and even then I just believe it was a prank. So this is why if you have the wrong idea of God, I think no evidence could convince you, because you don't believe in that God. Well, I don't either, and no one does, right? You're I've often poked atheists with this. You can't be an atheist if you don't know what the word God means. And so if you've got the wrong idea of God that no one believes in anyway, like that's a straw man to knock down. Psychologically, I think people understand. I mean, if you've seen religious believers of any kind, the sort of the life change that it would be to sign up for that. I'm at church every Sunday. Muslims are famously, 5 times a day, praying. The sort of thing you're signing up for is not a hobby. It's a whole of life thing. Like Christianity is something that is asking for all of you. And so I think there's an instinct of, it's the old thing about the camel's nose under the tent. You can't let the camel's nose get under the tent, because the whole camel is coming in afterwards, right? It won't just be the nose. It's all coming in. And so allowing this obviously major piece of, all right, so maybe there's a designer of the universe. What could that lead to is sort of scary if you haven't thought about it. And especially just this sort of instinct of maybe there's a being out there whose moral beliefs aren't just opinions, right? Because if you're an atheist, all of our moral beliefs are just opinions. You think something, I think something, they think, who cares, right? It's just another belief that's some atoms in my head. The idea that they might actually be true or false, that morals, and I think this is way deeper than you just want to sin. No, I think it's just an instinct of how much this would overturn my life as I like it and have it, to let this camel nose it, like God's existence in the door, like the whole foundation of reality changes. But they can tell stories about us as well, so it's hardly surprising.
Do you think it's ever the fact that humans don't really want there to be something greater than themselves?
Yeah, interesting. I think we do and we don't. It's funny, I was listening to an interview just yesterday. It was posted fairly recently with an atheist in the UK, Jimmy Carr, who's a comedian, TV presenter, quite well known. And he used this famous phrase from Blaise Pascal, famous scientist, mathematician, and Christian, who said there's a God-shaped hole in all of us, right? There's a bit missing that we feel it. It goes back, I mean, you can find the same idea in St. Augustine, 400 AD, saying, God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. That there's this just inner restlessness. So, to hear an atheist, like Jimmy Carr say that, so he was saying, we've got this God-shaped hole. What a shame there's no God. We're going to have to try and fill it with some other stuff. But I think there's, we want meaning and purpose to just be there, but at the same time, we don't, we want there to be meaning and purpose, but we don't want to be told what to do. We want moral right and wrong. You can't help but believe in right and wrong, right? No one's really a moral relativist, but I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. So there's a lot. This is the restlessness of the heart, right? Until they rest in you. So it's interesting that even as the new atheism of sort of a decade and a half ago is fading, people are thinking, okay, either we need religion, in which case if it's a nice religion, we'll sort of keep it around because that's great, or we need something equally compelling and also nice, right? The idea that we can just shift to nothing or just believe in the science is starting to seem very naive. That's my amateur take on it.
And some of the kind of colleagues you've worked with over the years, have you seen any changes in their stances on things, or do people seem to choose a lane and stick into it?
Yeah, that's a funny one. I have a bunch of colleagues who just were brought up believing in God, and went into science and still believe in God. It's funny, the ones who did believe in God and now don't, it seems to me, this is a small number statistics, but they had a sort of, they weren't brought up in a Christian, in a believing household, then suddenly got very interested in it and then sort of bombed out very quickly as well. So they were sort of avid believers for a couple of months and then, oh no, I've tried that, I can walk away. But everyone's got their own story. I've got my own story, so that's hardly surprising. I don't think there's any general trends. I think the new atheism is I don't see that sort of aggressive atheism. I didn't see it much anyway, and it's definitely waning. Certainly, I'm in the Australian community is slightly strange as an astronomical community. It's very small, and I'm in a very smaller part of it at Western Sydney University. But certainly, I don't see the kind of outright hostility just purely to God and to religious belief that might have been there from some people maybe a decade and a half ago.
Do you think, obviously cosmologists are right, astrophysicists, cosmologists are right at the coalface of these questions. Do you get a feeling that more of them believe that there is something like a higher power out there, or more of them don't?
I think, stats-wise, I think I heard this stat. I think of all the sciences, it's chemistry that's actually sort of the most believing. I think astronomy is probably up there as well. Generally, the physical science more than the biological sciences, and both of them way more than the social scientists. That's the latest stats I've heard, which is really very interesting, right? The universe is fine, chemistry all great, even life not too bad. But if you study humans,
That's it.
Yeah, fair enough.
We're done. Yeah.
Who can blame them? I know plenty of Christians in astronomy in Australia and overseas. And so I'm not sure if it's more than usual, but it's certainly not completely unheard of. I'd love to know some more detailed stats. But
Okay, we could look that up. And final question, just because you've mentioned him a couple of times, how do you assess Richard Dawkins' kind of contribution to the field of this discussion? Now he's kind of, I would say, fading out a little bit. What would you, looking back at his kind of what he's done in his career to this discussion, how do you assess it?
Interesting. So, the first thing about Dawkins is he's a phenomenal writer. I try to teach writing to the first year science students. I'm in charge of a course that does that. So I appreciate that a lot. There's been some evolution in his thought, appropriately. I actually think the first chapter of The Blind Watchmaker sets out a sort of criteria and a lot of detail there that okay, how do we actually see design? When do we conclude that design is the right answer? And he more or less agrees with Paley that, you wouldn't just accept any old explanation. So William Paley famously says, you're walking on a heath, a field. If you see a rock and someone says, oh, that rock's just been there forever, you might accept that as an answer. But if you saw a watch, you wouldn't, there's something else going on there. And so Dawkins spends a lot of that first chapter saying, the stuff we see in life is clearly more like the watch. He's got a wonderful discussion there of bat echolocation. Like how do bats see in the dark? Well, they essentially are just sort of screaming at the top of their lungs and then hearing their own echoes off the wall and navigating that way. So, which is incredible. And that's Dawkins' point. Like, this is remarkable. Some sort of amazing explanation of that is required. He thinks Darwin's got it. But there's a crucial part in that chapter where he says, biology is the study of things that look like they have the appearance of being designed. Physics is the study of simple things that do not tempt us to invoke design. So what he thinks he can do is if he can take the processes that made the bat and show that all of those are just physics and chemistry, right? And in the context of Darwinian mutation, natural selection, all of that sort of stuff. If he's reduced it down to it, then his job is done because because we're not tempted to invoke design at the level of physics, which is why then fine-tuning comes as such a shock, because, oh, hang on a second, we are tempted to invoke design at the level of physics. So his responses in the God delusion are quite interesting then, apart from the argument we mentioned before that no argument for God is good enough because you're always getting worse in terms of explanations, who designed the designer and all that. He basically punts for the multiverse. And very quickly, he sort of says, well, people tell me there might be a multiverse, and if that's true, then the anthropic principle, you wouldn't be here if life wasn't right for you, is a bit sort of like natural selection. If you're not able to survive, you don't survive. There's more to it. Not perfect analogies, but that's what he goes for. But I think at that point, it's quite clear that that's a pretty extreme thing to think. You better be sure that God's not on the table before you start saying, oh, it's definitely this multiverse idea. And if nothing else, it's a bit of a compliment to the fine-tuning argument that's the move you've got to make, right? If you say the origin of life proves God, he'll throw 1,000 theories at you. He'll say, no, we've got this, this, that, and the other, right? Where, of what we know about, life and prebiotic chemistry and all that sort of stuff, he'll at least give you a bunch of ideas. But to go bang on straight for the multiverse when you raise fine-tuning, that's a compliment. I think we can just take that compliment.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great place to end, actually. We've come full circle right back to where we started. So, and we've given credit to Dawkins. So thanks, Richard Dawkins. Luke, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for your time and your expertise and your way of communicating things in a very accessible way. I'm sure your students are very lucky to have you as their lecturer. Hopefully we can have another conversation about something, because I know from your book that you're actually, although you're professionally astrophysicist, you actually are quite well read in lots of areas of these type of topics, including philosophy and philosophy of religion and so on, which I think you've kept, unless you read your books, you wouldn't really realize. So hopefully we can have another chat sometime, but thank you again for today. If you have any questions or comments about this, please drop them in the comments below, and we'll make another video addressing some of those. Thank you for joining us today.